I welcome you to a lecture which is part of the course Writings on the Margins. In today's lecture, we are going to look at tribal writing, history and orality. That is the title. I am Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University, and I am going to discuss with you today the idea of tribal writing and the question of history and orality which is related to it. Now, the first thing that we say is that tribal writing is a product of history, but also it reconstructs and recapitulates it. Now, when I use the term reconstructing and recapitulating, now these are two very important terms for us to understand tribal writing vis-a-vis history. In fact, in this statement, we have a third dimension also, that is tribal writing is a product of history. So let's at length look at these three words or phrases and see what perspective do they bring out. So when we say that tribal writing is a product of history, it means that the writings which were written by or the texts that were written by the tribals then, they were the products of certain conditions. They were the result of certain conditions at a particular time in history. Now, what could these conditions be? Now, we all are aware that how the tribals have historically been marginalized. They have been on the margins of society, and that has resulted in a kind of a mistreatment that has been the source of prejudice, etc. against them, right? So, in such a circumstance that has been bias against the tribals, we see that in such a situation, the need was felt for some kind of a self-representation. Now, representation was not a part of the history or the times. They did not have scope for tribal representation, and therefore in such situations that were steeped in prejudice, tribal writing played a very crucial role. So when these particular conditions gave rise to tribal writing, that's what makes us say that it is a product of history, or it's a product or a result of certain particular social conditions, right? And we need to keep those in mind when we analyze or when we read any text by a tribal writer. Now, the other thing that we also said was that it reconstructs and recapitulates history. Now, first let's look at the word recapitulate. Now, recapitulate means what? To revise or to revive or to go over something. So, the texts of tribal literature or tribal writing then go over their history, their experiences. It's a kind of an expression or a revisiting of their own history by means of writing. Yes. Now, when they recapitulate their experience and present it in the written word, what do we notice? We see that they make a space for themselves in the mainstream, right? A history that had otherwise been obscured with their experience, which did not find mention in the popular discourse then, makes its space as tribal writing recapitulates the particular experience of this section of society, right? Now, it's not just a recapitulation or going over their own experiences and presenting them in a written form, but there's also a reconstruction in it. Now, when we say that history is reconstructed in tribal writing, over here the reconstruction is not exactly of their own history, but it's the mainstream history then which is reconstructed by means of tribal writing. So, which means what? It means that all the all those viewpoints that served to go against the experience of the tribals, or all those misconceptions that might have made their way in the popular discourse about the tribals then, are dismantled, and an alternate paradigm or an alternate perspective is presented in these writings, and thereby we say that history stands reconstructed, right? So this is the first point that we make vis-a-vis tribal writing and its engagement with history. Now, we've also seen that how in the mainstream historical narratives, the tribals have been largely absent, or one can say that there has just been a tangential reference at best. Okay? Now, why is that? One might question. We see that it's always the dominant social group that that makes their history the accepted ones, and we are aware that how the tribals have been on the social margins. So therefore, their history then gets kind of sidelined, and it is those who are who enjoy this privileged position, then they foreground their history and make it an accepted one. So therefore, when we look at such an idea of, if one can call it, a preferential history, this brings to mind an allied concept, that is of new history, that and we just now also talked about the idea of reconstruction. Yes. So now, when we say that in the light of this kind of a history which favors a particular section that is in authority, in the light of that, we realize the need for a new history. Now, what is this new history? Now, this would include the life of common people, the questions of women, Dalits, tribals. So basically, all those who form the social periphery then, and who therefore are ignored most of the times, or are obscured most of the times, their experience forms the center of this new or alternate history that we are talking about, right? And tribal writing then contributes to a construction of this alternate history. Now, if we go still deeper into this aspect, so we see that how the history of the tribals does not exactly comprise narratives which are documented in that sense, right? Why is that? Because of course their history goes far back in time. There have been scholars who've mentioned that it's the pre historic times. That's when, I mean, that's how far back their past goes. So that time when there was no technology of writing in that sense available. So that is of course one of the reasons why their history is not documented. The other, of course, is the lack of education, right? So how this section of society, because of being on the periphery, was not given an opportunity to educate themselves. So once they are not equipped to write, who would voice their experience in such a case then, right? So when we look at these two aspects, then one wonders that how did they retain their history then, when they were not equipped to write because of lack of education, when we say that it was not documented or collected, then how did they retain their history? Now, this question brings us to the idea of orality, right? So through oral narratives, they expressed their experience in songs, stories, narratives, ballads, etc. This became the source of tribal history, right? Or these oral sources then, that is songs that were sung, stories that were told, narratives, ballads, they carried details of the experience of the tribals, and as they traveled from one generation to another, we saw the history, the culture, the experiences of this social section then transmit across time, right? So it's the oral history then that we are talking about vis-a-vis the tribals. Now, when we look at the term orality, it has actually been used in a variety of ways, often to describe the structures of consciousness found in cultures that do not employ or employ minimally writing. Okay? Now, we say that it describes the structures of consciousness found in cultures that very minimally deploy writing. Now, when we say structures of consciousness, it basically means that how, what is the manner in which their experience, their sense of self, their identity, how that gets articulated in absence of the written word. So, the crux of this then is encapsulated in the term orality, that when there is no written word, how is it that the experience, the opinion, the perspective, the thought, the ideas, the awareness about their sense of self, the awareness about their surroundings, how all these then find a mention in the word which is not written. So all this then is encapsulated in the idea of orality. Now we see that if we look at this concept from the colonist point of view, we know that of course there has been tribal population in India, and they were there even while the country was under the colonial rule, right? Now the colonists then, their view of oral cultures actually introduced a very particular approach or attitude to orality. Now what is this, or what was this approach? Writing was deemed as a distinguishing factor between the civilized and the savages. So what does that mean? It means that that section of society which had an oral culture, which had an oral history, was then considered to be non-civilized, and that section which had writing, which had documented experiences, was considered to be the one which was civilized, right? So what do we see? That how then orality in the colonist point of view was associated with a lack of civilization, right? Now this is a particular approach that the colonizers had, but as we are aware, this is one of the perspectives, all right? While orality, we all understand, is as important, has played an equally important role as the written word, right? It has been the means of carrying the richness of experience of the tribals, the songs, the ballads, and how not just in terms of carrying the experience, all these oral sources then were also means for these people to celebrate together, to also so it in a way became a kind of a source of cultural memory in that sense, right? So calling it a mark of lack of civilization is of course to be taken with a pinch of salt, and is definitely problematic in that sense, right? So we see that the semi-literate people then eventually did begin writing. So while initially education was not at all available to the tribals, but with different social movements, different efforts at emancipation of the social section, there were a few changes that were brought about, and some sections of amongst the tribals then did begin to have access to education, and they became literate, right? But we see that even as this was true, at the same time, it must also be acknowledged that the others as well were writing about the tribals. Okay, so now when others, the non-tribals, write about their experience, this at one level, in a way one can say, alienated the tribals from self-representation. So when somebody else is talking about your experience, of course, their subjectivity, their viewpoint, their understanding will come in way. No matter how unbiased the individual might be, yet it is not the same as self-representation by the tribal themselves. So writing about the tribals and writings done by the tribals themselves are the two ideas which we need to keep in mind, and whatever text that we read, we need to factor in that who is the writer. Is the writer himself a tribal, or is it somebody sharing their observations on the tribals, right? So it would be good to perhaps also compare some of these texts, right? So the question then of reflected history in that sense becomes crucial. So reflected how? When others engaged with the experience of the tribals, then those narratives became reflected history, right? Which means that they came from the consciousness of somebody else. Now, we need to keep this in mind and keep this parallel to the writings or the narratives from the tribals themselves. Okay? From here, if we move to looking at the narratives that were written by the tribals themselves and how they engaged with the idea of history, we see that how historical memory, now these narratives make us understand that how historical memory became important to constructing community identities, right? So when tribal writing engaged with their experience, engaged with their history, we see that this kind of a memory then became a very, very important source to construct the community identity. An identity which was otherwise effaced, did not find mention in the mainstream, found space in these tribal narratives, right? Now, the way tribals recorded their own history and the culture in the narratives was very different from that of the colonial discoverers. Now, if you remember, even in the previous lecture and early on in this lecture, we did talk about that how the colonizers engaged with the tribals, right? Now, their mode of engagement and the terms in which they engaged with the tribals then was very different from the manner in which the tribals recorded their own history and culture, right? Now, it is observed that at one level, tribal experience of time has been recorded mostly in religious myth. Okay? Now, this is one of the observations which are made by the scholars, that how the tribal experience of time is recorded mostly in religious myth, and here time then is experienced as cyclical, and hence at times it is concluded that in such cases time is ahistorical. So, what do we see? We see a very particular or a unique engagement with the idea of time in the tribal narratives, right? Now, again, this is one of the perspectives that is part of the discourse surrounding tribal writing. But we also see that the other aspects of tribal narratives then also need to be kept in mind, right? So there were these other sources or other forms of expressions that were not exactly religious or mythic. So one, of course, we have said that they were in the form of religious myths where time was cyclical, right? The other form of expression were those that were not religious or mythic, right? Now, these were in the form of legends, songs and sagas that are part of the collective memory of the community of tribals, right? So, this was another aspect that made its way into tribal writing, and which then also becomes the source of tradition within tribal societies, right? So, not just religious myths which are where one notices time as cyclical, but also the form of legends, songs, sagas also contributed to the construction of a collective memory and became the sources of tradition within the tribal society, right? And it is here then, in the legends, in the songs, in the sagas, that their experience of change in time is recorded, as one can see these stories evolve with time, right? So, on the one hand, one perspective says that there is a cyclical time noticeable in the tribal narratives. On the other is this viewpoint that talks about legends, songs and sagas by the tribals, and here the time then is one whereby we see the idea of the experience of change that becomes predominant. How change then is articulated, change over a period of time gets articulated in these legends, songs, etc. And this record of change is also very much part of the tribal history that is presented through their narratives, right? So, as stories and these legends evolve with time, we notice or one can spot the evolution or the change in their experience and in their predicament as well, right? Now, in one notes that tribal narratives give us an understanding of identity and self-perception as well. So, after talking about the two kinds of maybe references or two kinds of or two styles of engagements that we see in the tribal narratives, next we say that how these narratives then give an understanding of identity and self-perception of these people, right? Now, when we say identity, of course, because they are engaging with their own experience, they are engaging with their own issues, their particular unique background, their particular unique celebrations, culture, different interactions amongst their community, etc. So, when these aspects find mention in the narratives, we very clearly see the idea of identity and self-perception becoming relevant, right? So, these are some of the things that we need to keep in mind vis-a-vis tribal writing. Now, we also see that how these narratives are a source of writing back. Now, what do we mean by the term writing back? That means that it is these narratives become, as I also mentioned in the beginning of the lecture, that these narratives become a means for the tribals to undo the bias that has always been associated with their community. Okay? And therefore, Rudolf C. Heredia in his article Living Word or Dead Letter, he mentions that tribal narratives embody, and I quote, cultural action for freedom, unquote. So, this phrase that Rudolf Heredia uses, cultural action for freedom, is very, very relevant to understand what the tribal narratives were doing. We need to approach these narratives, we need to approach tribal writing from this perspective, that how they embody an action in the realm of culture for the sake of freedom. And freedom for what? Freedom from what? Freedom from a prejudiced, biased understanding of their social section, right? So, that becomes a very, very important standpoint from where one may approach their writings. Now, of course, we also see that how the reconstructed history is transmitted through which is transmitted through an appropriate pedagogy, then it goes a long way towards a positive self-assertion. So as history is reconstructed in these narratives, it becomes a very crucial aspect which enables positive self-assertion. So these narratives then should also be read in order to see how are they asserting or how are they facilitating a kind of positive self-assertion by the tribals, right? Now these are some of the conceptual ideas, certain conceptual pointers which we need to keep in mind whenever we are reading any text written by a tribal author. The next thing we say that there's a, once we see that what these writings achieve, we see that of course there's also a crucial difficulty which needs to be overcome, right? And what is that? That these narratives or the writers need to extend beyond the boundaries of caste, class, religion, community, etc. Now these boundaries need to be broken for these narratives then to actually have an impact that they are intended to have, right? So as these challenges then become weaker, we see that the tribal voice becomes stronger in redefining what we understand as the mainstream. So we need to see that how these how the tribal narratives engage with the reconstruction and recapitulation of history. They are a product of a particular kind of history. Then we see that the way in which they intervene with the mainstream history. We also discussed the difference between the idea of reflected history, which is when others talk about the tribals vis-a-vis the case when tribals talk about themselves, right? And then we moved on to a discussion of how historical memory then becomes an important tool for constructing for constructing community identities. From there on, we looked at some of the tropes that one noticed in the tribal writing. Then we looked at that how tribal narratives then can become a way of us understanding the question of identity and the question of self-perception of the tribals. And finally, we said that tribal narratives then embody a cultural action for freedom. And when this reconstructed history through the tribal narratives is transmitted, it goes a long way towards asserting a positive, it actually goes a long way towards a positive self-assertion. Thank you.